Hello, comrades, and welcome to another video on the Chinese Revolution Area of Study 2. In this video, we'll look at the period known as the Great Leap Forward. Now, this was a very significant time in the history of the CCP and the PRC. And here is a great quote from Mao. He said, "I have witnessed the tremendous energy of the masses. On this foundation, it is possible to accomplish any task whatsoever." So here's a little bit about the lead up to the Great Leap Forward. So in mid-1957, the first five-year plan was coming to an end. Mao wanted a more radical degree of collectivization, feeling that planning had become over-centralized. And so a second five-year plan was drawn up and approved by government economists. Mao felt contempt for bureaucratic and expert planners, seeing regulations as a preventative to the productive forces of the masses. And on the 12th of December 1957, Mao declared that China would beat Britain's steel output through the collective will of the Chinese people. So Britain was leading the world in steel output, steel production, and Mao made this was quite a great declaration by Mao to say that China would overtake Britain, and it was setting quite high goals, while also showing contempt for expert planners and believing that the masses could bring about this great leap forward that he was hoping to see. Mao is quoted as saying, "If you are too realistic, you can't write poetry," i.e. you need to be somewhat utopian in your views and idealistic in order to make great things happen. He spoke of an economy that would walk on two legs through simultaneous development. Now, he saw the peasants as key to this great leap forward. He thought that peasant labor was untapped outside the planting and harvest seasons. So Mao wanted to rely heavily on projects that got peasants to produce more goods, improve rural infrastructure, and encourage collective values. Just like the Yan'an Soviet during the Civil War, cooperatives would engage in the small-scale production of goods required by rural communities, making use of lower grade raw materials. The official launch of the Great Leap Forward took place at the 8th Party Congress of the 5th to the 23rd of May, 1958. Now, I mentioned this in my first five-year plan video. There were two 8th Party Congresses, one in 56 and one in 58. So the 1958 8th Party Congress marked the official launch of the Great Leap Forward. Rather than a detailed economic plan, the Great Leap Forward was a declaration of revolutionary intent, a push to advance socialism. Mao argued for the need to let the people explode, encouraging a greater degree of collective organization in the countryside. Now, Mao's general line of the Great Leap Forward is something to remember, a quote to remember. It says, "Go all out, aim high, and achieve greater, faster, better, and more economical results in the building of socialism." So that was really the general line that was used about the Great Leap Forward and kept being referred back to. So again, you can see that this general line reads more like a motivational speech than it does an economic plan. So hence why the Great Leap Forward was more a declaration of revolutionary intent than an economic plan for the future. Provincial officials, frustrated by the lack of development in rural areas, were truly inspired by this general line. And so they really pushed for this greater collectivization. Historian Philip Short is quoted as saying, "Mao at this time was on an adrenaline high, pumped up by the limitless vista of a bright communist future in which nothing would be able to withstand the concerted efforts of 600 million people," that being the population of China at the time. People's communes. So here's a quote from Mao. He said, "The People's Commune is great." Now, the context of that quote is that when Mao was touring Shandong province in August 1958, he saw a banner that read People's Commune. It was the first time that Mao had heard the term, and he liked it very much. And a reporter overheard him remark that the People's Commune is great. And the next day, Mao's declaration appeared on the front page of every newspaper. So what started as a declaration from Mao about this people's commune that he had seen in Shandong province was widely circulated. And so the idea of the people's commune spread rapidly. So in late 1958, 740,000 agricultural cooperatives were reorganized into 26,000 people's communes. The People's Daily stated that the main features of the People's Commune are that it is bigger and more socialist. So a people's commune averaged 5,000 households and had populations of up to 100,000 people. So much more than the 100 to 300 families that made up a higher agricultural cooperative. There was complete collective ownership and farming of land. Smaller fields were combined into larger ones and tilled by thousands of people at a time. Tools and livestock became collective property, so there was no private ownership of tools or livestock. Wages were paid in work points, which could be exchanged for everyday items. Work points were reasonably significant because each category of worker, no matter whether they were young males, elderly people, women, they all received the same number of work points regardless of actual hours worked and regardless of actual output. So it was truly communist in nature. So money was abandoned and work points were introduced. Now, the reason I say that work points are significant is that they will feature later in this video to see why the Great Leap Forward, one of the reasons why the Great Leap Forward may have failed. Large collective creches allowed parents more time to work in the fields. Communal kitchens and eating halls were introduced to foster a collective spirit among the people, and elderly people were brought together and cared for in what's called happiness homes. Now, the administration of public welfare, schooling, local defense, farming, and small industry were all the responsibility of the commune. And ordinary people were genuinely enthusiastic for the people's commune. There are some fantastic quotes about the people's enthusiasm in your textbook on page 187. So, for example, Li Jisui said, "It was an exciting experience. Something big was happening in the Chinese countryside, something new and never seen before." A peasant named Zhao Tongmin had fond memories of working in this commune. He said, "Those were the days. Whenever I sit at home and think about it, I feel happy again. What was so great? The fact that so many people came together. Their discipline was marvelous. Everyone came to work on time and all joined in with a will. No line divided village from village, people from here and people from there. Those were great days, great days." Sidney Rittenberg, who was a translator for Beijing's National Radio Service, recalled, "I felt the thrill of being one of the people who didn't just talk about changing the world, but actually did something about it." So these people's communes were really a push towards communism, as the name commune suggests, and people were genuinely enthusiastic for it. So Mao had made that declaration in 1957 that China would overtake Britain in steel production. And so backyard steel furnaces were set up all over China. So since the steel industry was struggling to meet proposed targets, this campaign to build backyard steel furnaces was introduced to boost production. Mao is quoted as saying, if these small backyard steel furnaces can really produce so much steel, why do foreigners build such gigantic steel mills? Are foreigners really so stupid? So looking at some statistics, 750,000 backyard furnaces were built and 100 million people worked to produce more steel. So that's a sixth of China's population were working at these backyard furnaces. Many peasants worked at backyard furnaces and failed to do some of their farming. So they focused so heavily on steel production that agricultural production lacked. Vast woodlands were destroyed for fuel, and tools and woks and anything that they could find that contained steel were all melted down to produce more steel. Harrison Salisbury is quoted as saying, "The country looked as though it had been picked clean by iron-eating ants." So while peasants made steel, they were encouraged to eat as much as they liked at communal kitchens, consuming food reserves that had yet to be replenished. You can see where this is going with peasants working so much to produce steel, eating more than they had. You can see where this is going with an inevitable famine on the way. Now, the steel campaign failed. Peasants were smelting tools into worthless scrap metal. There was a 9% decrease in the amount of farmland sown with crops. So really, the backyard steel campaign was a monumental failure. So here's a photograph of a backyard steel furnace at this time. So here we have Chinese people setting up their furnace with mud bricks and pouring in tools to the furnace to melt down into steel. So these sorts of scenes were seen all over China from people from all walks of life, peasants, workers, everyone contributed to the backyard steel campaign. Lysenkoism. So the Great Leap Forward was driven by a disregard for past experience and expert advice. The 100 Flowers campaign previously had really led to the ostracization of intellectuals. And while Zhou Enlai had known that intellectuals would be needed to advance society, by the end of it, with the anti-rightist campaign, that was sort of abandoned. And so the Great Leap Forward was really driven by a disregard for the experts. Kang Sheng, who was a secretary of Mao's or an advisor of Mao's, said, "We should be like Marx, entitled to talk nonsense. What is science? Science is simply acting daringly. There is nothing mysterious about it. Just act recklessly and it will be all right." As you know, that's not always the case. Sometimes science is about taking risks, but this is vastly simplifying what science actually is and what advancement in society actually looks like. So the CCP, anyway, this brings us on to Lysenkoism. The CCP sought to boost crop yields without relying on expensive imported chemical fertilizers or tractors. So farmers were encouraged to use methods based on the theories of Soviet agronomist, which is someone who specializes in soil, Trofim Lysenko. And now he claimed that crops would grow anywhere in the world if they were looked after, which goes against classic biology, that certain conditions are needed for crops to grow. He also encouraged deep plowing, which was quite out there in terms of agricultural theory. So he encouraged people to plow sometimes 3 meters below the usual plowing level. This made topsoil infertile by mixing it with clay and sand. He also encouraged close planting of rice, which restricted the amount of wind that passed through the crops, resulting in poor quality rice and lower yields. So this so Lysenkoism, this move to try a sort of out there form of agricultural production, didn't have the intended effects. The Four Pests campaign. So here's a great poster of Chinese people attacking these four pests. So the CCP sought to increase crop yields without relying on pesticides or fertilizers, which were in short supply. The Kill the Four Pests campaign aimed to rid China of flies, mosquitoes, rats, and sparrows, as these were seen to spread disease or damage crops. Peasants spent hours killing as many of these creatures as they could. However, this had unintended consequences. So while sparrows did damage crops by eating the crops, and while that crop damage from the sparrows was reduced, the nature of the food chain meant that less sparrows equaled more locusts and other insects. So they multiplied and attacked crops, starting a locust plague. So this eventually had the opposite effect of what had been planned and contributed to grain production falling by 25% between 1958 and 1960. I should note that this, along with Lysenkoism, contributed to that grain production falling. Statistics. So with many of the country's best statisticians purged during the 100 Flowers campaign, misinformation and manipulation of statistics led to disaster. Production of grain was not tied to set quotas, with commune activists pledging to produce unachievable harvests. So I should find a statistic to back that up. So for instance, while they would essentially, sorry, I'm stuttering a lot. I can't find a good statistic, although there are some in your book on pages 190 and 191. So basically the commune activists, the provincial cadres in the countryside were pledging to produce harvests that had never been seen before. So 3, 4, 5 times more than what they had ever produced previously. Good news reporting stations took the place of proper accounting, with central authorities only told about plentiful harvests and not poor ones. Show fields were also set aside for officials to inspect, containing recently transplanted rice and grain. So basically making it look like they were producing more than what they actually were. And commune officials inflated grain figures to fulfill their quotas, their self-made quotas. And Mao came to believe these inflated reports. There were skeptics, however. So Tian Jiaying, one of Mao's secretaries, said, "In the past, our party has always sought truth from facts, but this isn't what we're doing now. People are telling lies, boasting. This is ridiculous. It is shameful." So the manipulation of statistics led the party to believe that and led Mao to believe that the peasants were producing more food than they actually were, which had devastating consequences. So the government negotiated export sales to fund their heavy industry based on the faulty statistics that were being given to them by party cadres in the countryside that indicated a large grain surplus. This led to debates about how China might deal with its abundance of food when it really didn't have any abundance of food. Nations with close ties to China even received shipments of free grain. So North Korea, North Vietnam, places like that, they received free grain from China when China didn't have enough grain to start off with. So here are some statistics of the grain harvest in these 3 years of 1957 to 1959. So in 1957, they produced 195 million tons. In 1958, they produced 200 million tons, so a slight increase. However, this was falsely reported as 450 million tons, so more than 2 times what they were actually producing. And in 1959, grain production fell to 170 million tons, but this was falsely reported as 500 million tons. So nearly 3 times what was actually being produced. In reality, grain production fell due to poor management and because peasants had run out of enthusiasm with a lack of incentives. So with the people's communes and the work point system, it didn't really matter how much you produced or how many hours you worked. Everyone received the same number of work points, which led to people not working as hard. Due to false reporting, central authorities imposed high grain levies. So still believing this false reporting, they imposed these taxes. So starting at 30% of grain being collected by the state, this figure rose to 90%. They thought the peasants have plenty of food to feed themselves, so we can take more food to export. Remember that grain was the major export in China. But since many communes had already consumed their stores of food, grain requisitioning meant peasants had nothing to eat. So again, I should go back and say, again, as we can see with Lysenkoism, with backyard steel production, with the Four Pests campaign, and with the false reporting of surplus, you can see that food is starting to become scarce, even though the government believes that they have an abundance. The Wuhan Plenum. I don't know how to pronounce that. Plenum. Anyway, from the 28th of November to 10th of December 1958, a central committee plenum, which was basically a meeting. I'm just going to call it a meeting. The central committee meeting was held with one of the topics for discussion being some questions concerning people's communes. The meeting agreed that the general line was right, but implementation of grain levies had been hasty and careless. So let's remind ourselves of the general line. It is go all out, aim high, and achieve greater, faster, better, and more economical results in the building of socialism. So it was decided that a harvest of 370 million tons rather than 450 million was more realistic. Now, remember, this is in a year when 450 million tons had been reported. And so they thought, okay, let's ease it off and actually produce 370 million tons, which is still almost double what was actually being produced. So it wasn't realistic at all, but due to this false reporting, the Central Committee thought that it was. Reduced levies meant production quotas were also reduced. Some private markets were allowed to reopen. Families were allowed time to tend their own small plots, and food was no longer provided in communal kitchens. At the Wuhan meeting, it was announced that Mao Zedong would stay on as CCP chairman, but would stand down as China's president, with Liu Shaoqi becoming president in April 1959. The Lushan Plenum. So July 1959, leading CCP figures gathered at Lushan for a central committee meeting. Mao opened the Lushan Plenum saying, "The achievements are tremendous, the problems are numerous, the experience is rich, and the future is bright." So clearly ignoring all of the devastating situation that was taking place in the countryside. Defense Minister Peng Dehui, having visited his home village to find villagers hungry and living in squalor, criticized the Great Leap Forward as a rash advance to communism and argued that the CCP was overcome by winds of exaggeration. Mao presented the Politburo with an ultimatum. So I should say, First of all, that this led to Peng and Mao butting heads quite a lot at the Lushan Plenum. And eventually Mao said that either they need to follow Mao's leadership, or he would go to the countryside, raise another Red Army and overthrow the government. Now, the Politburo was concerned by this. They knew the cult of personality that Mao held. And so as a result, they all sided with Mao. So on the 16th of August, 1959, the Central Committee condemned Peng Dehui and reaffirmed the general line. A new anti-rightist campaign was launched with 350,000 anti-Great Leap Forward rightists purged from the CCP. Now, the Lushan Plenum was incredibly significant because it showed that Mao was in charge. He wouldn't be opposed again after this, and one communist official, Wang Bingnan, later recalled, after Lushan, the whole party shut up. We were afraid to speak out. It stifled democracy. People didn't tell Mao their honest opinions. They were afraid. This led straight to the terrible times of the Cultural Revolution. So think about the years that this is taking place. I mean, this is in 1959. Mao has basically, as Wang Bingnan said, stifled democracy. People didn't tell him their honest opinions. They were afraid to speak out. This comes just 3 years after Mao's 100 Flowers campaign, where he called for people to speak out and criticize the party freely. So he's clearly had a change of heart, and now with the Lushan Plenum, he really took control of the party. Now, I said that there would be a famine, and here we are. So the CCP, following Mao's advice, doubled down on people's communes and Lysenkoism. Grain targets were set at 270 million tons, and the Great Leap Forward continued for another year after Lushan. Historian John King Fairbank said the result was an all-time man-made famine. The Great Leap Forward had played itself out as a Mao-made catastrophe. Officials continued to report to the central authorities that everything was fine and tried to prevent news of the growing famine from leaking. I intended to put that classic meme in with the everything is fine with the fire in the background, because that's exactly what this was. So these provincial party cadres were still saying that everything was fine in the countryside while a famine was breaking out. People ate anything they could get to fill their stomachs. They had no food. They would eat bark, they would eat sawdust, grass, whatever they could find. Cannibalism was widespread. So children were being eaten fairly frequently. Husbands sold their wives and daughters into prostitution. Thousands of children were abandoned or orphaned. Now, between the 3 years of 1959 to 1961, at least 30 million people died of starvation. The Great Leap Forward was abandoned in 1961, and Mao, humiliated, withdrew from party leadership in 1962, leaving Liu Shaoqi as the de facto leader of the party. So I really glossed over the 3 Bad Years Famine. You should really have a look in more detail at that section of your textbook and do a little extra research about it. So it's on pages 197 to 199 of your textbook. And yeah, there's much more detail about the 3 Bad Years Famine, but basically you can see where this all came from. It came from the Great Leap Forward having a lack of expert advice. It came from the backyard steel production that drew peasants away from the farms, and it came from the introduction of communal kitchens, where people who were working at these steel furnaces were encouraged to eat as much as they wanted. It came from Lysenkoism and the Four Pests campaign that both had unintended consequences leading to poor harvests. So you can see why a famine occurred, but it was one of the most devastating famines in human history. It says in your textbook, there's a quote that so it says, Jasper Becker is the leading Western expert on the Chinese famine. He concludes that while up to 40 million may have died, 30 million is the most reliable figure. He adds that from a moral perspective, debate over death statistics is meaningless. In terms of sheer numbers, no other event comes close to this. So it really was a devastating famine. So finally, let's just have a look at some historical interpretations of the Great Leap Forward. So Morris Meisner said it was the product of a utopian social vision, not an economic plan. It relied ultimately on the revolutionary enthusiasm of the masses. That's a really interesting quote because this revolutionary enthusiasm seemed to be there in the early years of the Great Leap Forward and the People's Commune. But with work points and grain requisitioning, that revolutionary enthusiasm definitely reduced. Jonathan Femby said the Great Leap showed Mao more and more divorced from any true reality check, and he himself seemed to care less and less for the consequences. Now that aligns with some of the quotes in your textbook from Mao. He said in 1959, he reportedly said, even if there's a collapse, that'll be all right. The worst that will happen is that the whole world will get a big laugh out of it. So not taking into consideration the millions of people that were about to die. On another occasion, he said, working like this with all these projects, half of China may well have to die. If not half, 1/3 or 1/10, 50 million die. So Mao didn't seem to care much for the consequences, as Jonathan Femby said. Zhong Chang and John Halliday, Mao's greatest opponents, says Mao's predatory regime worked everyone to the bone, then took everything. Mao knowingly starved and worked tens of millions to the death. So there are some historical interpretations of the Great Leap Forward. I hope you found this video interesting and informative. I know it's been quite a long video and there's a lot in it. So please do take your time and revisit it when and if you need it. And I will see you next time.